I guess I'll start by saying that this happened around 4 or 5 years ago. I was either a sophomore or junior in high school, I don't really remember. My best friend at the time was invited to one of her friends' birthday parties, and invited me as her plus one. We got all dressed up and headed out. At some point during the party, around 9 or 10 p.m., we had the brilliant idea to leave and go catch a train downtown. We start to trek to the nearest station, and since neither of us drove, being literal kids in heels and walking through a sketchy part of Chicago, we decided to flag down a cab to get us there. When we get there, we failed to realize that there was a building we could have waited in, which would have been a much more safe alternative in hindsight. So we climb up what I remember to be around 3 flights of old wooden stairs and wait for the train to arrive. I want to point out that while the platform was elevated, people driving past could see anything happening up there, and there are 2 cases of stairs on each side of the platform itself. After about 5 or 10 minutes of waiting, we see on the other side of the tracks a man in all black, with his hood up. My friend and I are completely sketched out and try not to look at him, but we decide to stay because he isn't really bothering us in any way. I looked over at him and realized that instead of facing the tracks in front of him, his body was positioned our way and staring directly at us. I whispered to my friend to start walking down the stairs because at this point I realized we might be in a dicey situation. The platform is long, and while we're far away from him, we're also far from our side of the stairs as well. As we were walking, I look back and see him now walking towards us, and we flip out. We're trying to run, but we're slow, being in literal 5-inch heels, and I look back once more to see him now running after us. Miraculously, we made it to the bottom of the stairs, and while running to the street, there's this red sedan just sitting in the middle of it, window down and looking at us. Before we even say anything, he says something along the lines of, "Are you okay? Get in the car, I'll help you." I guess my friend was panicking, and she opens his door to get in, but before her butt lands on the seat, I pulled her away, because, obviously, stranger danger. I tell him that I'm on the phone with 911 and ask if he can just wait with us until they arrive. But before I can even blink, his windows rolled up and he sped off. We run to the nearest restaurant and wait to get picked up. I realized by this point that the man had never come down the stairs, and I decided to hang up on 911 before anybody even answered. Looking back, I try to think rationally about the situation. Could that man have just been trying to scare us? And maybe that guy in the sedan was really just trying to help us, but something in the back of my head makes me think maybe it was some kind of scheme to get us into his car. It took me years to even tell my parents about this, because I felt if I told people it would make the story more real, I guess. It's easily the scariest thing that's ever happened to me in my life. Anyway, in 2007, my family took a long weekend trip to Chicago. I was 15 and my brother was 18. We're from Michigan, so we took the train from Holland, and I recall on the last day arriving to the train station to head home. We found an area to sit down to wait about an hour or so until our train arrived. I asked my mom if I could go find the platform that our train would be leaving from, and she said no. After some well-executed begging on my part, she finally gave in. So, off I went. I walked down and found the platform. I took a couple of pictures of the train station, and just as I turned to walk back where my family was, I felt a grip around my arm so strong I immediately winced in pain. Half of me expected to turn and find my brother playing a prank on me, but when I did turn, I saw a man that I had never seen before. I still remember his face. Weathered, angry. I'd guess he was in his mid to late 50s, perhaps. He had on a brown Carhartt jacket and a red t-shirt with a baseball hat. He stood there looking at me, gripping my arm tighter and tighter, and I felt frozen. Everything they taught me as a kid about being kidnapped, such as, run, kick, scream to draw attention to the situation, went completely out the window. I felt like I couldn't scream, like I couldn't move, and I was literally just so scared I felt like I couldn't do anything. He looked at me and mouthed, "Shh," and gripped my arm tighter, and started to walk me away in the opposite direction of my family. I pulled my arm away, still not being able to even scream, and he grabbed my arm again. Thankfully, something washed over me. I'm assuming it was a rush of adrenaline because I ripped my arm away from him and started running in the opposite direction. To this day, I feel like I ran faster on that day than I ever have in my whole life. I never turned back to see if he was following me or not. I ran and I jumped into my brother's lap. I looked up just in time to see him come into the area that my family was in, and he pretended to look at a broken vending machine and turned and walked away. I woke up the next morning with bruises on my arm where he grabbed me. That day will probably haunt me forever. I'm a 25-year-old female, and about 6 years ago I was attending university in the UK. I moved about 3 hours away from my hometown to help with the costs of living. I had a part-time job at a hardware store, where I either worked extremely early or extremely late shifts. This particular day I had finished a late shift and was making a walk to the nearby train station. This station is small, and it only has 2 platforms with a bridge to get to either side. It's usually unmanned, so the whole thing is public access, with the ticket office rarely being open. This particular evening, I was standing on a path just outside the station, about to have a smoke. I'd like to make it known that a few people were on the platform at this point, so I felt fairly safe. As I was rolling my cigarette, I felt an uncomfortable feeling of being watched. When I looked up, there was an older man with dirty clothes that reeked of alcohol making a beeline for me. I'm fairly used to meeting people like this in the area, so I just try to be polite, and when he began to speak to me and asked for a cigarette, I obliged. I stood there smoking with him, listening to what he had to say. At first, the conversation was actually pretty normal. He talked about things like how he was waiting for his train, which so happened to be the same as mine, but I didn't tell him that. But then the conversation devolved into something much worse. Eventually, he begins to tell me about how he's hard. At this point, I start to feel real panic as I'm between this man and the wall. Despite being frightened and telling him that I need to get to my train soon, there's still plenty of people on the platform, so I'm not completely alone with this freak. I notice at this point that he's still smoking, so I say something along the lines of, "Okay, I really gotta go, I don't want to miss my train." I run past him onto the platform, moving as fast as I can towards a random woman I see sitting on a platform bench. Suddenly, the man behind me starts screaming a bunch of obscenities and trying to call me back. I remember feeling pure panic by this point. I know he was probably drunk and probably wouldn't do anything on a public platform, but I really didn't want to chance it or have to follow him onto the train. I noticed a gap between the bench I was moving towards and a vending machine nearby, so I decided to duck down into it. The man didn't notice me duck into the gap and walked by as he was looking for me up and down the track, still shouting the same thing that he was before, although sounding more annoyed now more than desperate. I remember exchanging a glance with the woman on the bench, and she never said a word, thankfully. Then, at that moment, a train pulled up to the platform, heading in the opposite direction to where I needed to go. And by some miracle, this man, in his drunken state, staggered onto the train, and off he went. I've never felt such relief in my life as I did watching that train pull out of the station.